In the winter of 1871, the village of Ballycrea sat quietly beneath a sky that never seemed to change. The clouds hung low, pressing against the land like an unspoken warning, and the fields surrounding the stone cottages lay stiff and colorless. People in Ballycrea were accustomed to silence, not the peaceful kind, but the careful kind, the kind built from generations of knowing when not to speak. It was here, in a narrow house with a roof that leaked during heavy rain, that Catherine Doyle was born. She did not cry the way other babies did. The midwife noticed it first. Not that the child was silent, she did cry, but there was a pause before it, a delay, as if Catherine were listening to something before responding to the world. The midwife later said nothing of it. In Ballycrea, unusual observations were treated like loose threads, better left unpulled. Catherine's mother, Margaret Doyle, was a woman shaped by loss. She had buried 2 children before Catherine arrived, both claimed by fever before their names had fully settled into memory. When Catherine survived her first winter, Margaret considered it a blessing. When the child reached her 3rd birthday without illness, Margaret began to believe God had finally stopped watching her too closely. She was wrong. By the time Catherine learned to speak, the house no longer felt empty, not because it was loud, but because it felt occupied. Margaret would often pause while cooking, certain she had heard footsteps behind her. When she turned, there was only Catherine, sitting quietly, her eyes fixed not on her mother, but on the far corner of the room where the light never reached. "What are you looking at?" Margaret asked once. Catherine did not answer immediately. "He doesn't like when you shout," the child said finally. Margaret laughed, too quickly. "There's no one there, love." Catherine frowned, as if confused by the denial. "Yes, there is," she said. "He just doesn't belong here anymore." Margaret scolded herself for letting the words linger. Children imagine things, everyone knew that. But that night, when her husband Sean returned from the fields and mentioned casually that old Mr. Hargreaves had been buried that afternoon, Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. Hargreaves had died in that same corner of the house years earlier, before the Doyles had moved in. No one told Catherine that. Over the following months, small things began to happen. Catherine repeated conversations she could not have heard. She asked questions about people she had never met. She described rooms inside houses she had never entered, always quietly, always without drama, as if she assumed everyone already knew. The village priest, Father Callahan, was the first outsider to take notice. He had come to bless the house after Margaret mentioned, carefully, that Catherine heard too much for her age. Callahan smiled in the way priests do when they plan to dismiss concerns gently. He knelt to Catherine's level and asked her what she had heard. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. "You shouldn't have buried the letters," she said. "They're still wet." The smile left his face. No one in Ballycrea knew about the letters Father Callahan had burned the previous autumn. No one except the man who had helped him bury the remains by the riverbank. That man had died 2 weeks later. The priest stood up slowly. Children were supposed to imagine angels or demons or fairy folk whispered about in old Irish stories. They were not supposed to speak about specific guilt. They were not supposed to name sins that had never been confessed. By the time Catherine turned 6, people stopped speaking freely around her. Doors closed more often. Adults watched her the way one watches a storm forming at sea, distant but with growing unease. Catherine noticed, of course. She always noticed. What she didn't understand was why truth made people afraid. One evening, she asked her mother a question that would change everything. "Mama," she said, "why did Mrs. Keene cry when her baby stopped breathing, even though she was the one who held the pillow?" Margaret dropped the plate she was holding. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Mrs. Keene's child died in its sleep. That was the story, the official one.
the one repeated at church and carved into memory. No one had ever said otherwise, not aloud, not even in whispers. Catherine did not smile, she did not whisper, she did not dramatize the words, she simply spoke them. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She watched Catherine breathe, half expecting the child to say something in her dreams. When morning came, Margaret realized the truth she had been avoiding. Her daughter was not repeating stories, she was revealing things that had been deliberately buried. And Ballycrea, a village built on secrets, was not ready for a child who refused to keep them.
After that night, Ballycrea was no longer the same village Catherine had been born into. It was not that people accused her openly. They did something far more dangerous. They adjusted around her. Women lowered their voices when she passed. Men paused mid-sentence and cleared their throats. Children were pulled indoors at the sound of her footsteps. Catherine noticed the shift the way animals sense weather before a storm. She did not understand its cause, but she understood its meaning. She was no longer safe. At school, the teachers stopped calling on her. When Catherine raised her hand, the lesson moved on. Once, when another child struggled to answer a question, Catherine whispered the correct response, something the teacher had only mentioned privately to the headmaster earlier that morning. The classroom went silent. The teacher struck the desk harder than necessary. "Quiet, Catherine," she snapped. "You speak too much." Catherine looked genuinely confused. "But you were going to say it next," she replied. "You always do." That afternoon, a letter was sent home. By the end of the week, Catherine was no longer welcome at the school. The reason given was vague: disruptive behavior. No one wanted to explain what the disruption actually was. At home, Margaret Doyle began to pray differently. Not for protection, for restraint. She begged God, if he was listening, to quiet whatever voice followed her daughter, to take the knowledge back, to make Catherine ordinary. But prayers, when asked too late, often echo unanswered. Catherine did not stop speaking. She spoke to the neighbor about the money hidden beneath the floorboards. She asked a man why he still smelled smoke from the barn fire he swore was an accident. She told another woman that the ring she wore had belonged to someone who drowned and never meant to give it away. Each truth landed like a small explosion. The village priest returned, this time not alone. 2 men accompanied him, quiet, watchful, official in posture. They asked to speak to Catherine privately. Margaret refused at first, clutching her daughter close. But pressure has many forms, and faith was one Ballycrea knew how to weaponize. Catherine sat across from them calmly. Father Callahan asked gentle questions. Catherine answered gently back. Then she tilted her head and said something that none of them were prepared for. "You're afraid because you think I choose what to say," she said. "I don't. I just hear it." "What do you hear?" one of the men asked. Catherine looked past him. Things that never got forgiven. The meeting ended quickly after that. From that day on, Catherine was no longer treated as a child. She was treated as a risk, and risks in places like Ballycrea were managed quietly. The following winter was harsher than the last. Snow sealed roads. Isolation deepened. Catherine spent most days indoors staring at the fire, as if listening to it speak. Margaret noticed her daughter talking less, not because the voices had stopped, but because Catherine had learned something far frightening. Truth, when spoken, had consequences. One night, Catherine woke screaming, not from a dream, but from recognition. She told her mother that something bad was coming, not sickness, not weather, something decided, something human. Margaret held her daughter until morning, knowing in her bones that the village had crossed from fear into resolve.
When spring arrived, so did a stranger, a man from outside Ballycree, a man with papers, a man who asked too many questions and listened too carefully. Catherine watched him from the window and said only one thing: "He's here because of me." Margaret's hands began to shake, because deep down she already knew the truth. Catherine Doyle had not been born cursed. She had been born in the wrong place, in the wrong time, among people with too much to hide. And Ballycree was about to decide what to do with a child who could not keep their secrets.
The stranger was Thomas Whitmore, though in Ballycree, names mattered less than intentions. He arrived on a gray afternoon, his boots still clean enough to mark him as someone who had not walked far through fields or mud. He carried a leather satchel, neatly clasped, and papers that bore stamps no one in the village fully understood, but everyone respected. He said he was there on church business. That was enough to open doors. Whitmore asked about births first, then deaths, then irregularities in parish records going back nearly 20 years. His questions were polite, careful, and unsettling in their precision. He did not accuse, he simply compared. Names that vanished, causes of death that repeated too often, confessions that never reached paper. Catherine watched him closely. "She doesn't like him," Margaret said quietly one evening, noticing how her daughter avoided the room whenever Whitmore visited. "Who?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. The silence. "He listens too hard." One evening, Whitmore finally asked to speak to Catherine directly. Margaret refused again, but refusal in Ballycree was a temporary thing. Father Callahan insisted. He spoke of God's will, of understanding, of clearing misunderstandings before they became rumors. Margaret's resistance softened, not from belief, but from exhaustion. Catherine sat across from Whitmore at the kitchen table. He asked her nothing strange at first: her age, her name, what she liked to do. Catherine answered calmly. Then Whitmore leaned forward, lowering his voice. "People say you know things," he said. "Things you shouldn't." Catherine did not deny it. "They tell me," she said simply. "Who tells you?" She paused, frowning. "People who aren't finished yet." Whitmore's pen stopped moving. He asked about Mrs. Keene's child, about the letters Father Callahan burned, about the barn fire. Catherine answered every question, not eagerly, not dramatically, but with the tired patience of someone correcting mistakes. By the end of the interview, Whitmore's face had gone pale. That night he wrote until his hand cramped, and that night Ballycree changed forever. If you're hearing this and realizing how deep this story goes, make sure you're subscribed. These aren't just stories, they're pieces of history most people never want spoken out loud. The next morning, Whitmore requested records from the church, old ones, sealed ones. Father Callahan hesitated for the first time in his life. That hesitation was enough. Whispers spread fast in small villages. By sunset, Ballycree knew something was wrong, not because of what Whitmore said, but because of what he wrote down. Catherine sensed the shift before anyone spoke of it. She became quieter, withdrawn, spending hours staring out at the fields as if measuring distance. When Margaret asked her what she saw, Catherine answered in a whisper, "They're deciding." "Who?" Margaret asked, though dread already sat heavy in her chest. "Everyone." The men of the village gathered without calling it a meeting. The women noticed, and no one asked where the children were sent that night, only that they were sent away. Plans were discussed without names like harm or removal. Ballycree had always preferred implication to honesty. One voice spoke louder than the rest. "She's not evil, but she brings evil out." That sentence sealed Catherine's fate. Whitmore was told his services were no longer required, his papers returned, his stay shortened. The explanation was courteous,
the pressure was not. By the time he left Ballycrea, he carried copies of records he should never have been allowed to take. Catherine watched him go from the window. "He won't forget," she said softly, "but they will try." That night, Margaret packed a small bag, not because she knew exactly what was coming, but because every mother knows when waiting becomes more dangerous than moving. Catherine did not resist. She simply asked one question: "Will it be quiet where we're going?" Margaret did not answer, because even she did not know if silence was still possible.
Ballycrea did not vote. It never had to. Decisions in the village had always formed the same way mold forms in damp rooms, quietly, invisibly, until it was everywhere. By the time words were spoken aloud, the outcome was already agreed upon. Catherine Doyle's presence had become unbearable not because she caused chaos, but because she introduced clarity. And clarity is dangerous in places built on carefully maintained half-truths. Margaret felt it the morning after Whitmore left. The air had changed, not colder, not louder, just resolved. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now watched her openly. Conversations stopped when she approached, not out of fear of Catherine hearing, but because there was nothing left to hide from her mother. She was no longer considered unaware. She was considered complicit. Catherine stayed close to her that day, unusually silent. "What are they thinking?" Margaret asked softly as they walked the narrow road toward the fields. Catherine answered without looking up. "They're trying to remember how it felt before I talked." Margaret's throat tightened. "Can they?" she asked. Catherine shook her head. "No. Once something is said, it stays said, even if people pretend it wasn't." By evening, Father Callahan arrived unannounced. He did not sit. He did not pray. He spoke as one speaks when trying to sound merciful while delivering judgment. He said the village was unsettled, that rumors had escaped, that higher authorities were paying attention, that Catherine's condition had become a liability. He emphasized concern for the child's safety, for Margaret's reputation, for the community's stability. Margaret listened quietly. When he finished, she asked a single question. "Where?" Father Callahan hesitated. "There are places, institutions, homes for children who experience confusion." Catherine looked up. "That's not where they take children like me," she said. The priest's face hardened. "Catherine," he warned. "They take us where no one has to listen," she continued calmly. Silence fell like a verdict. That night, Margaret made her choice. She would leave. Before the village could act, before paperwork could be written, before Catherine could be categorized, classified, and quietly removed. She packed what little they had and planned to leave before dawn. It wasn't courage that drove her, it was instinct. The same instinct that had told her something was wrong the first time Catherine spoke of a man who had died in the corner of their house. They did not make it far. Just past the edge of the village, where the road narrowed and trees pressed closer, a cart blocked their path. Two men stood beside it, men Margaret knew, men who had once smiled politely and looked away. They spoke gently, too gently. They said they were only there to help, that Father Callahan was concerned, that there were arrangements, temporary ones, that Margaret could visit, that Catherine would be cared for. Margaret screamed. Not loudly, not dramatically. She screamed like someone who understood that resistance had become symbolic. Catherine did not cry. She stepped forward and said something that would later be remembered by those men in pieces, never fully, never comfortably. "It's all right, Mama," she said. "They already decided before we started walking." Margaret fought anyway. They took Catherine. If you're still listening right now, you already understand. These stories don't end cleanly. Subscribe to the channel if you want to hear the rest the way it actually unfolded, not the way it was officially recorded. The village called it relocation. The church called it care. The records called it transfer. No document ever stated why Catherine Doyle was removed. No official ever described what she had said or what she had known. Her name appeared once more in the parish book, followed by a line drawn cleanly through the remainder of the page. That line was meant to signify closure. It did not. Margaret was warned not to speak of Catherine again. She was told grief was natural, but fixation was not. Within months, neighbors stopped asking about her daughter entirely. Silence returned, not because the truth had been buried, but because everyone agreed it was safer not to remember it fully. But Catherine did not disappear. She was seen. A farmhand claimed he heard a child's voice listing names during confession hours. A nurse at a regional home wrote of a girl who corrected her notes before she finished writing them. A clerk dismissed after insisting that a child knew details of deaths never recorded. Each account was isolated, explained away, forgotten. But together, they formed a pattern. Thomas Whitmore filed his report 3 months later. It was rejected, not because it lacked evidence, but because it contained too much. The report referenced inconsistencies, unreported deaths, sealed confessions, and a child whose knowledge could not be sourced. The margins were marked with questions, then stamped with a single word: unreliable. Whitmore resigned shortly after. The last official mention of Catherine Doyle appears in a ledger dated late 1971. It reads simply, "Female child, age unknown, condition unresolved. No cause, no outcome, no follow-up." Margaret Doyle died years later, having never stopped waiting for footsteps that never came. Those who remembered Catherine learned to remember her incorrectly, as a troubled child, as a rumor, as a story exaggerated by time. But stories that survive exaggeration often do so because they began with something precise, something true. And in Ballycrea, even now, there are people who lower their voices when a child asks the wrong question, because somewhere deep in memory, they remember a girl who listened too well and spoke anyway. The place did not have a name people used aloud. On paper, it was called St. Bridget's Home for Wayward Youth. In conversation, it was referred to only as the home, as if specificity itself might summon something unwelcome. It stood beyond the main roads, where carts passed less frequently and letters arrived already damp from neglect. Stone walls surrounded it, not to keep children safe, but to keep questions out. Catherine arrived before sunrise. The men who brought her did not sign their names. The woman who received her did not ask questions. Catherine was measured, weighed, listed, and assigned a number before anyone asked her how old she was. When asked her name, she answered clearly, "Catherine Doyle." The woman paused, pen hovering. "No surnames," she said flatly, "just Catherine." Catherine nodded. "That's all right," she replied. "They stop using them after a while anyway." That sentence was never written down. The dormitory smelled of soap and iron and something older, fear that had settled into the walls and learned to stay quiet. Rows of beds lined the room, each identical, each stripped of anything that might suggest individuality. The children spoke little, not because they were forbidden to, but because speaking had taught them nothing good followed. Catherine noticed immediately that the other children avoided her eyes, not out of cruelty, out of instinct. Children learn quickly who brings attention, and attention in places like St. Bridget's was a currency that always ended in punishment. The first night, Catherine did not cry. She lay awake, listening. Institutions have sounds that villages do not, rhythmic, procedural sounds, keys, footsteps counted unconsciously, doors opening not when needed but when scheduled. Somewhere in the building, a child coughed the kind of cough that meant no one would come. Catherine whispered into the dark, "Someone will die here soon." No one responded. By morning, a boy in the East Wing did not wake up. The staff said it was illness. The children knew better than to ask which one. Catherine learned the rules quickly. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not remember your life before. Do not contradict authority. Do not say names. But rules are only useful when they align with reality, and Catherine's reality refused to cooperate. During lessons, she corrected dates the instructors had memorized wrong. She named towns none of the children had come from but recognized instantly. She knew which nurses would be replaced before letters arrived announcing them. At first, the staff thought her clever, then troublesome, then dangerous. A file was started. It described her as observant, then fixated, then delusional. Each new note contradicted the last, but the conclusion remained the same. Catherine was not to be encouraged. Isolation followed. Not solitary confinement, that would have required acknowledgement. Instead, Catherine was placed where conversations simply did not occur. Assigned tasks away from others, meals eaten last, lessons taken alone. And still information found her. A woman once sat beside her during sewing hour and whispered, without knowing why, that she had buried a child before ever naming it. Catherine told her where the grave was. The woman fainted. A visiting inspector dismissed Catherine's claims as attention-seeking until she mentioned the man's brother, the one no one in the family acknowledged. The inspection ended early. After that, Catherine was no longer allowed to speak to visitors. They called it treatment. Time passed differently inside St. Bridget's. Days repeated, seasons arrived late, news came filtered and already stripped of consequence. Catherine aged without birthdays, only marked by changes in her chores and the tightening of rules around her. But the thing the institution never understood was this: Catherine did not seek secrets. Secrets sought Catherine. At night, children whispered to her even when instructed not to. They told her things they didn't know they remembered, about homes they'd been taken from, about adults who said the right words while doing the wrong things, about accidents that felt planned in hindsight. Catherine listened. She always listened. And sometimes, when the weight of it became too much, she spoke. She spoke names softly, so softly that only the walls heard her. The walls remembered. By 1873, staff turnover became noticeable. A nurse transferred suddenly after claiming a child knew details of her private letters. A groundskeeper left without an explanation. The head matron began keeping her door locked even during daylight. Officially, Catherine was making things up. Unofficially, she was becoming unavoidable. Thomas Whitmore returned to the region that winter. He did not come as an official. He came as a man who could not sleep properly anymore. His resignation had not quieted his conscience. It had sharpened it. He followed rumors, fragments, footnotes. Every trail bent back towards the same place, St. Bridget's. He requested access. It was denied. He requested again. He was told the child no longer existed in any actionable capacity. Whitmore stood outside the gates one evening as snow began to fall and wondered how many lives could disappear simply by being mislabeled. He never saw Catherine, but he heard her, not with his ears, with recognition. Because when a system spends enough effort convincing you something isn't real, it's usually because it already knows it is. Whitmore left behind a letter. It was never delivered. It said only this: "If she is still there, please tell her I'm sorry I listened too late." Catherine remained at St. Bridget's until her name stopped appearing in reports entirely. No discharge record exists, no death certificate, no burial log. Some say she was transferred again. Others say she learned when to stop speaking aloud. A few insist she never left at all, that she simply learned how to disappear within walls designed for forgetting. What is known is this: after Catherine Doyle vanished from the records, the institution changed its procedures. New confidentiality rules, tighter archives, fewer written details, more verbal instructions, as if someone had learned the danger of leaving a paper trail. And even now, in old buildings repurposed as schools, hospitals, or offices, there are rooms no one uses.
rooms where acoustics feel wrong, where people lower their voices without knowing why, because places remember, and so do children who were never meant to.
There are two kinds of silence. One is empty. The other is full of things waiting. St. Bridget's silence changed after Catherine stopped appearing on paper. Not immediately. Institutions never react honestly at first. They tighten, they revise language, they invent new words for old actions. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Staff no longer joked during meals. Keys were checked twice. Doors were closed more carefully, as if the building itself might overhear carelessness. Children noticed first. They always do. New arrivals whispered that the older ones avoided certain corridors. A stairwell on the west side was suddenly locked for repairs that never seemed to end. The room Catherine had once cleaned was repurposed, then abandoned, then quietly avoided altogether. No one said her name. But names don't require permission to exist. At night, some children swore they heard soft footsteps pacing where no one should be. Others said they dreamed of a girl sitting at the foot of their beds, not frightening, just watchful, listening the way Catherine always had. The staff dismissed it as hysteria. They always do. In the spring of 1874, the first fire broke out. It was small, contained, officially accidental. A stack of archived documents deemed non-essential had been destroyed. The incident report noted minimal loss, but what burned was not random. Old intake logs, early correspondence, letters that predated the revised filing system, records with surnames. No one could explain how the fire started. The stove in that wing had been cold for days. The children assigned to cleaning duty that night swore they hadn't been near the room. One girl, shaking, said she had heard someone whisper before the smoke appeared. "What did it say?" a matron demanded. The girl swallowed. "It said we didn't need them anymore." She was punished for lying. But the fires continued. If stories like this matter to you, stories that history tried to erase, subscribe, because forgetting is exactly what these places depended on. By summer, St. Bridget's reputation began to shift, quietly. Inspectors arrived unannounced, donations slowed, a priest transferred after requesting access to sealed records. The head matron took ill, an illness that doctors could not name, marked mostly by paranoia and the belief that someone was reading her thoughts before she spoke them aloud. She began sleeping with a candle lit. She claimed darkness made it easier for things to move. Her journals were later found filled with repetitions of the same sentence: "She doesn't need to speak anymore." Outside the walls, Catherine Doyle's name began surfacing in unlikely places. A clerk in a county office found it written in the margin of an old ledger he did not remember annotating. A doctor in Baton Rouge received a letter signed simply C, containing details of a childhood patient he had never documented but never forgotten either. And Thomas Whitmore, who had long since stopped expecting forgiveness, began receiving anonymous packages. Inside were copies of documents he had once believed destroyed, not originals, memories. Someone was reconstructing a story that was scattered on purpose. What frightened people was not the idea that Catherine might still exist. It was the possibility that she had learned how to outgrow them. Because power depends on being the only thing that remembers, and Catherine remembered everything. By the time St. Bridget's officially closed, there was no ceremony, no announcement. The institution simply ceased operations, its children redistributed, its staff reassigned, its records lost during transition. The building stood empty for years. Locals avoided it,
Animals refused to nest there, and yet neighbors reported lights in the upper windows on certain nights, steady, patient, as if someone were waiting for others to catch up. When the building was finally demolished, workers found something strange behind one of the sealed walls. Not bones, not letters, just names. Hundreds of them etched into the stone itself. Children's names, full names, carefully spelled, repeated where necessary as if to ensure permanence. At the center, carved deeper than the rest, Catherine Doyle. No date, no ending. Historians still argue about her. Some say she was a gifted observer misunderstood by a cruel system. Others suggest collective guilt created a myth larger than the girl herself. A few refuse to discuss her at all. But every few years, a new document surfaces. A letter, a marginal note, a testimony that was never meant to survive. And they all share one unsettling detail. The writer always describes the feeling that someone already knew what they were about to confess. Catherine Doyle did not expose secrets. She revealed that secrets were never safe to begin with.
History is supposed to be silent. Ink dries, paper yellows, names stay where they are written. That is the comfort people take in archives, the belief that the past is finished, contained, obedient. Catherine Doyle ruined that illusion. In 1909, nearly 4 decades after St. Bridget's closed, a junior archivist named Eleanor Hart was assigned to catalog uncategorized materials in a county storage facility outside New Orleans. It was dull work, forgotten work. The kind of job given to someone no one expected to notice patterns. She noticed everything. Boxes arrived mislabeled. Dates contradicted themselves. Documents referenced meetings that had no corresponding minutes. Entire years appeared to have been compressed, edited, rewritten in a different hand. And then she found the name. Not in a file, in the margins. Small, precise, written as if added later, but using ink that predated the document itself. Catherine Doyle. Eleanor frowned. She searched the index. Nothing. She searched again. Still nothing. But once you notice a name, it begins to appear everywhere. In expense reports, in correspondence between clergy, in medical summaries where a child was referenced but never identified. Always Catherine, never explained, never introduced. Eleanor did what archivists are trained not to do. She followed the trail. The deeper she went, the more inconsistent the record became. Catherine Doyle existed in fragments, too many to be coincidence, too few to be acknowledged. Every attempt to isolate her produced more references, as if the system itself were resisting erasure. What disturbed Eleanor most was not the frequency of the name, it was the timing. Several documents included information that could not have been known at the time they were written. Deaths that occurred years later, scandals that had not yet surfaced, transfers that were officially unexpected. And always somewhere nearby, Catherine's name hovered, not as author, as witness. Eleanor began bringing work home. At night, she dreamed of corridors she had never walked, of a girl sitting calmly in rooms that did not exist on any floor plan, listening, always listening. Her husband noticed she stopped sleeping through the night. "She's just a child," Eleanor murmured once, half awake. Why were they afraid of a child? If you're still listening, subscribe. Because the moment you stop paying attention is when stories like this get buried again. Eleanor requested access to sealed ecclesiastical archives. The request was denied. She requested again. This time she received a warning, not official, personal. A senior clerk pulled her aside and told her gently that some histories were incomplete by design, that reopening certain narratives served no one,
that curiosity, while admirable, could become dangerous if it insisted on clarity where none was intended. Eleanor asked one final question. Was Catherine Doyle real? The clerk did not answer. He only said, "We changed the filing system because of her." That was the moment Eleanor understood. Catherine was not a problem because she spoke secrets. She was a problem because she proved secrets were fragile. In 1912, Eleanor published a small, unremarkable paper in an academic journal with limited circulation. It did not accuse, it did not speculate wildly, it simply documented inconsistencies, repeated anomalies, the statistical impossibility of certain errors clustering around a single name. The paper was ignored, publicly. Privately, Eleanor's career stalled. Her access was reduced. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends became cautious in conversation, as if unsure which topics might follow them home. She began receiving letters, unsigned. They did not threaten, they corrected her. Dates she had gotten wrong, names she had misattributed, events that she had assumed were unrelated. The letters knew things she had not published. Eleanor burned the last one without reading it fully. She stopped her research soon after. In her personal journals, never released, she wrote only this: "I think she didn't want revenge. I think she wanted witnesses." Catherine Doyle's story does not end with proof. It ends with persistence, with the understanding that systems built on silence must work constantly to maintain it, revising language, destroying records, discouraging memory. And sometimes they fail. Sometimes a child listens long enough that forgetting becomes impossible. To this day, historians argue, was Catherine Doyle a gifted child crushed by institutions, a myth created by collective guilt, or something else, something that existed in the spaces between record and reality? But every few decades, the name resurfaces, not loudly, patiently, as if waiting for the world to be ready to listen.
By the 1930s, Catherine Doyle had become something historians did not like to name: a problem of continuity. Her story refused to behave. It did not stay in one decade. It did not belong to a single institution. It did not end where it was supposed to. Every attempt to finalize her narrative resulted in new contradictions, new fragments that surfaced just when interest began to fade. And fading interest was always the goal. A sociologist at Columbia once summarized it bluntly in a private letter. Some cases persist not because they are unsolved, but because solving them would expose too many solved lies. Catherine Doyle was one of those cases. In 1937, a schoolteacher in rural Pennsylvania reported something unusual. A girl in her class, no more than 9 years old, had submitted an essay describing a stone building she had never seen. She wrote about narrow corridors, iron beds, and a stairwell that led nowhere. She used language no child of her background should have known. When asked where she learned these things, the girl replied simply, "I didn't learn them, I remembered them." The teacher dismissed it as imagination, until the girl added, "There was another girl there before me. She listened better." The essay was confiscated. The teacher never mentioned it again, but she kept a copy. In the margin, she wrote a name she had never heard before without knowing why: Catherine Doyle. If you're still here, subscribe. Stories like this survive only because someone chooses not to scroll past. By mid-century, Catherine's name appeared less frequently in official contexts and more often in personal ones. Diaries, marginal notes, oral histories passed quietly through families who could never explain how certain knowledge had entered their lineage. Details about relatives no one talked about, about institutions no one admitted sending children to, about decisions made for the greater good that never sat right afterward. What linked these accounts was not supernatural language, it was familiarity. People described the feeling that someone had been listening long before they spoke, that their silence had already been understood. In 1964, during renovations of a former orphanage in Louisiana, not St. Bridget's but built from the same architectural plans, workers uncovered a sealed cavity behind a collapsed wall. Inside was a small collection of objects: a ribbon, a button, a scrap of cloth embroidered with a single initial, C. No documentation connected the items to any recorded resident, but one of the workers, an older man who had grown up nearby, stared at the objects longer than the others. My grandmother used to say that the buildings remembered the children better than we did. Modern scholars now approach Catherine Doyle cautiously. Her name appears in footnotes more than chapters, in discussions about institutional memory, collective guilt, and the ethics of erasure. She is referenced as an anomaly, a composite, a case study, rarely as a child, because acknowledging her as a child forces a more difficult admission that adults knew what they were doing, and that at least one child noticed. There is no final document that proves Catherine Doyle's fate. No grave, no portrait, no confirmed last sighting. What remains instead is a pattern, one that repeats wherever systems prioritize order over truth, silence over accountability. A child who listens, an institution that panics, a history that edits itself. Somewhere, perhaps, in an archive not yet cataloged or in a memory not yet trusted, Catherine's story is still unfinished, not because it lacks an ending, but because it was never